The narrative opens by confronting the viewer with a brutal economic reality. A massive oil crisis is no longer a distant geopolitical headline. It is a direct assault on your personal finances. If you find yourself asking, "Why should I care?" the answer is waiting for you at the gas pump and the grocery checkout line. Picture this. Just 30 days ago, you were filling up your tank at a relatively stable price of under $3 per gallon. Today, you watch the numbers on the pump spin uncontrollably toward the $4 mark. According to industry analysts, the 2022 record of $5 per gallon, a price that previously crippled consumer spending, is expected to be shattered within mere weeks. In states like California, the reality is even grimmer, with prices already screaming past $5.60. But gasoline is only the tip of the iceberg. This crisis triggers a lethal domino effect across the entire supply chain. Because the heavy-duty trucks that deliver your bread, milk, and eggs run exclusively on diesel, the surge in diesel prices, which has skyrocketed by over 35% in just the last month, is about to be baked into the price of every single item at the grocery store. This creates a double whammy effect. Consumers are being squeezed by high transit costs while simultaneously facing runaway food inflation, leaving the average household with almost no room to breathe in their monthly budget. The catalyst for this global chaos was a date that will likely be etched into history books, February 28, 2026. In an unprecedented show of force, the United States and Israel launched the most massive, highly coordinated air campaign seen in the 21st century. The objective was clear and surgical: neutralize Iran's rapidly advancing nuclear program. Over 7,000 targets, ranging from deep mountain weapons facilities to sophisticated command and control centers, were pulverized in a matter of hours. The shockwaves of this mission were not just physical, but political. Within the first 24 hours of the bombardment, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had held absolute power for 36 years, was killed. To the outside world, it appeared the war was over before the smoke had even cleared. The top layer of the regime had been effectively decapitated. The prevailing theory in Western intelligence circles was that with the leadership gone and the military infrastructure in ruins, the Iranian people would rise from the bottom up and transition to a new government. However, this was a catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of a collapse into democracy, the vacuum was filled instantly. Within days, Khamenei's son was rushed into power as the new supreme leader. His first act was not to sue for peace, but to unleash an economic counteroffensive so devastating it redefined modern warfare. Realizing they couldn't win a head-to-head dogfight against the U.S. Air Force, Iran began firing back at everybody. They launched 500 ballistic missiles and 2,000 drones in a single week, hitting not just military bases, but the literal crown jewels of the global economy: Dubai International Airport and Qatar's Ras Laffan, the world's single largest LNG facility. By hitting neutral neighbors and energy hubs, Iran sent a chilling message: if we go down, we are taking the global economy with us. The most shocking revelation of the 2026 crisis is not that the U.S. military was defeated in a traditional battle, but that it was rendered irrelevant by a combination of low-cost technology and financial leverage. Iran's strategy utilizes a layered denial approach that makes the cost of entry for any vessel, military or commercial, unacceptably high. The stealth minefield. Iran deployed a stockpile of roughly 6,000 mines. While cheap contact mines, costing only $1,500, are a threat, the real ship killers are the EM-52 rocket-propelled rising mines. These sit silently on the seafloor and launch upward only when they detect a specific acoustic signature, giving tanker crews zero reaction time. The swarm logic. By utilizing over 1,000 small, fast attack boats reaching 80 miles per hour, the IRGC creates target saturation. Even the most advanced U.S. destroyer cannot track and neutralize 50 incoming speedboats and explosive suicide drones simultaneously when they are launched from hidden coastal caves and civilian fishing ports. The analysis highlights a significant gap in U.S. naval readiness that many analysts overlooked: the minesweeper deficit. The U.S. decommissioned its battle-tested Avenger-class minesweepers in late 2025. Their replacements, littoral combat ships, have proven unready for the high-intensity Death Valley environment of the Strait. The Karg Island dilemma. While the U.S. could technically seize Karg Island with a small force of Marines, the analysis labels this a suicide mission. Holding an island within range of thousands of Iranian coastal rockets and drones while the strait remains mined does nothing to reopen the flow of oil. Finally, the power dynamic has shifted toward a new axis: Russian intelligence. Iran is providing the satellite imagery and electronic warfare support that allows Iranian missiles to stay mobile and invisible to U.S. sensors. The Chinese exception. While the world starves for energy, China continues to receive oil via the Shadow Fleet. These tankers operate with transponders off, using non-dollar payment systems, ensuring that China remains the only major power with a functional energy umbilical cord through the crisis. In the world of finance, there is a dangerous obsession with every word that comes out of Jerome Powell's mouth. Investors treat a Fed press conference like a trailer for a blockbuster movie, believing that the Fed's interest rate dial controls the entire universe. But there is a massive systemic misunderstanding of how the plumbing of the global economy actually works. The Federal Reserve controls the federal funds rate. This is the short-term or overnight rate. It is the rate at which banks lend to each other for 24 hours. While this is important, it is not the backbone of the economy. The real backbone is the long end of the yield curve, the 10-year, 20-year, and 30-year Treasury yields. As legendary investor Ray Dalio points out, these long-term bonds are the risk-free basis for all asset returns. Here is the catch: the Fed's influence, indirect and limited. The market's influence, absolute. Long-term rates are driven by supply and demand. If the United States is running trillion-dollar deficits and needs to sell massive amounts of debt, but its largest buyer, Japan, is pulling back, the supply of debt explodes while demand collapses. The result? Long-term yields must rise to attract new buyers, regardless of what Jerome Powell says about short-term rates. This explains the mystery of 2024 and 2026. Why do mortgage rates stay at 6 to 7% even when the Fed talks about cutting rates? The anchor: mortgage rates are not anchored to the Fed's overnight rate, they're anchored to the 10-year Treasury yield. The stagnation: if global demand for treasuries weakens because of the Japanese repatriation, the 10-year yield stays pinned at a high level. The consequence? Home affordability remains strained, refinancing activity dies, and the housing market stays in a state of frozen transactions. The Fed can cut the short rate all they want, but if the long rate doesn't cooperate, your monthly mortgage payment isn't going anywhere. It isn't just houses, it's the entire corporate world. In 2020-2021, capital was on sale at 90% off. Companies issued debt like it was Black Friday, fueling massive expansion and high stock valuations. But as the yen carry trade unwinds, that cheap liquidity, the oxygen of the market, is being sucked out of the room. When long-term borrowing costs stay elevated, valuations compress. Analysts use long-term yields to discount future cash flows. Higher yields equals lower stock prices, even if earnings stay the same. Risk appetite falls. Investors stop chasing growth and start hoarding cash. Growth slows. Companies stop hiring and stop expanding because the price of money has permanently changed. We have arrived at the most critical realization of this financial deep dive: the lie of automatic liquidity. For years, the market has been conditioned to believe that the Federal Reserve is an all-powerful deity, that if Jerome Powell simply cuts rates, the economic clouds will part and the sun will shine again. But as we have seen through the lens of Japan, this is a dangerous oversimplification. Traditional financial media loves clickable narratives: inflation, AI, or NVIDIA's weekly performance. These are loud, visible, and easy to digest. But they ignore the cross-currency carry trade because it requires patience, nuance, and a fundamental understanding of global capital flows, things that don't trend on social media. The narrative we are being sold is that liquidity is automatic. The truth is that liquidity is oxygen, and that oxygen has been supplied by Japan for 30 years. If the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt decides to step back, the oxygen levels drop everywhere, regardless of what the Fed does in Washington. If the Fed cuts short-term rates while long-term yields stay elevated due to a lack of Japanese demand, we get what is known as a steepening yield curve. This is a nightmare scenario for many models. Valuation compression. Stock analysts use long-term yields as the discount rate. Even if a company's earnings are perfect, a higher long-term yield mathematically forces the stock price down. The end of cheap refinancing. Corporations that gorged on cheap debt in 2021 are now hitting a maturity wall. They must refinance at these new, higher long-term rates, which will eat into profits and stifle innovation. The real risks to the economy are rarely the ones everyone is shouting about. Political drama and tech bubbles are priced in, meaning the market has already prepared for them. The real threats are systemic, boring, and hidden in the plumbing of the bond market. The unwinding of the yen carry trade is not a one-day event. It is a structural shift in how money moves across the planet. We are moving from a world of infinite Japanese Wi-Fi to a world where capital has a real, tangible cost. Summary: the new financial reality. Japan was the anchor. That anchor has been lifted. The Fed is not the pilot. They only control one small lever. Liquidity is no longer free. The math has flipped, and the global shopping spree is over. As the duct tape continues to peel, the winners in this new era won't be those following the loud headlines, but those watching the boring bond yields in Tokyo. While the previous sections dealt with macroeconomic shifts and military hardware, the true weight of the 2026 crisis was felt in the daily lives of the 8 billion people who woke up to a world that had suddenly become much smaller and more expensive. As power grids struggled with the loss of LNG, liquefied natural gas for electricity generation, a new phenomenon emerged: automated energy triage. The hierarchy of power, governments implemented smart grid rationing, where power was automatically diverted from residential entertainment and non-essential commerce to hospitals and water treatment plants. The digital tax. Data centers, which consume massive amounts of electricity, were forced to implement slow mode for non-essential services. For the first time, high-speed internet and cloud storage were treated not as a right, but as a high-cost luxury tied directly to the price of a barrel of oil. The 2026 crisis effectively ended the era of frequent flyer culture and the dream of the universal personal automobile. The death of low-cost travel, with jet fuel prices reaching levels that made short-haul flights economically impossible. The world saw a return to long-distance rail and sea travel. International tourism, once a pillar of global GDP, collapsed into a domestic-only industry for all but the ultra-wealthy. Urban reorganization. The crisis accelerated the 15-minute city not by policy but by necessity. Suburbs that were entirely dependent on cheap gasoline became stranded assets, leading to a massive migration back into high-density urban cores where public transit remained the only viable way to survive. Perhaps the most permanent change was the shift in human perspective. The global village was replaced by the fortress mentality. The trust deficit. After witnessing how quickly neighbors and allies turned on each other to secure fuel shipments, the public's trust in international institutions, UN, IEA, WTO, hit an all-time low. The return to the local. There has been a cultural renaissance in local craftsmanship, regional agriculture, and community-based mutual aid. People stopped looking at the world map and started looking at their neighborhood map. Referencing the educational content of this period, the character of Bob, the financial stickman, became a symbol of a lost era of simple 50-30-20 budgeting. In the post-2026 world, Bob doesn't worry about saving for a new car. He worries about the energy density of his household and the caloric cost of his commute. The petrodollar system is not merely an economic mechanism. It has been the literal backbone of United States global hegemony since the early 1970s. However, the current situation highlights a brutal reality. This dominance is being shaken more violently than at any point in its 52-year history. For over half a century, oil was the strategic commodity that forced every nation to hoard USD to keep their economies running. Today, Iran, a pivotal link in the Middle East, is directly challenging this rule of law by reportedly demanding payment in Chinese yuan or CNY for passage through the Strait of Hormuz. This is no longer a theoretical threat. Russia and China have been settling energy deals in local currencies for years. Iran's public stance creates a dangerous precedent. De-dollarization is shifting from a political trend into an operational reality on the ground. While the West struggles with volatile energy prices, China has quietly constructed an energy fortress. With a massive strategic reserve of approximately 1.4 billion barrels and direct pipeline access to Russian oil that bypasses maritime choke points entirely, Beijing holds a distinct advantage. If the Strait of Hormuz were to shut down completely, China is positioned to sustain its operations for at least 4 months, whereas the rest of the world would plunge into immediate chaos. This fundamentally shifts the balance of power. The capacity to survive a global economic shock is now tilting heavily toward the east. The fact that Asian insurance companies are beginning to quote shipping premiums in yuan rather than dollars is a critical signal that an alternative financial infrastructure is already operational. When the connective tissue of global trade, insurance, logistics, and settlement no longer relies on the USD, the effectiveness of U.S. economic sanctions evaporates. The tools used to enforce the world order for decades are becoming obsolete in real time. While the world's attention is often fixated on the price of crude oil at the pump, the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz reveals a much more terrifying vulnerability: the potential collapse of the global agricultural supply chain. Modern civilization is essentially built on calories provided by nitrogen-based fertilizers. These fertilizers are derived from natural gas, and the Persian Gulf is home to some of the cheapest and most abundant gas reserves on the planet. The text highlights a staggering fact: 1/3 of the world's fertilizer trade passes through this single narrow waterway. Specifically, Qatar alone accounts for 14% of the global supply of urea. With Qatar's largest fertilizer plants shutting down and nearly 1 million metric tons of cargo stranded, the agricultural clock is ticking toward a disaster. Unlike the strategic petroleum reserves maintained by major powers like the U.S. and China to stabilize oil prices, there are no strategic fertilizer reserves anywhere in the world. Agriculture operates on a just-in-time delivery model. If farmers in breadbaskets like India, Brazil, or the American Midwest miss the spring planting window because they cannot access or afford nutrients for their soil, the result isn't just higher prices, it is a literal reduction in the volume of food produced globally. We are looking at a transition from expensive food to no food for the world's most vulnerable populations. The disruption is already devastating the working class across Asia. In countries like India, food delivery workers, the backbone of the new gig economy, are seeing their livelihoods evaporate as fuel costs consume their daily earnings. Governments are taking desperate measures: the Philippines' 4-day work week, Thailand's take the stairs policy, and Bangladesh's total closure of universities. These are not just inconveniences, they are signs of a systemic failure. The United Nations warning that 45 million additional people could face acute food insecurity by mid-year underscores that this is a humanitarian catastrophe disguised as a geopolitical conflict. Beyond agriculture and energy, the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz strikes at the very heart of the 21st century's most critical industry: high-tech and artificial intelligence. This is a hidden layer of the conflict that many analysts overlook, but it connects the desert sands of Qatar directly to the server farms of Silicon Valley. Most people associate helium with party balloons, but it is an irreplaceable industrial gas. It is the only element capable of reaching the ultra-low temperatures required to cool the silicon wafers used in semiconductor manufacturing. The Qatar factor. Qatar supplies roughly 1/3 of the world's helium. The South Korean vulnerability. About 65% of Qatar's helium exports go to South Korea, the headquarters of Samsung and SK Hynix. These two titans produce nearly 2/3 of the world's memory chips. Without this cooling agent, the production of the chips that power everything from your smartphone to the massive AI servers training the next generation of LLMs, large language models, could grind to a halt. The text reveals a startling financial dependency. The American tech economy is currently being kept afloat by a bubble funded by Gulf oil money. Sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have committed approximately $2.5 trillion in investments tied to U.S. technology. The venture capital backbone. These Gulf states are the limited partners, or LPs, who provide the actual cash for the world's largest venture capital firms. When OpenAI or xAI raise billions, a significant portion of that capital often originates from the very oil fields currently under threat. If the Gulf states' infrastructure is crippled, their ability to bankroll the AI revolution vanishes. This turns a regional shipping crisis into a Wall Street and Silicon Valley liquidity crisis. This financial tie creates a geopolitical trap for Washington. When the leaders of the GCC, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, call the White House, they aren't just allies, they are the paymasters of the American tech future. Their national survival, specifically their desalination plants that provide up to 99% of their drinking water, is now under drone and missile fire. The U.S. may find it has no choice but to intervene militarily, not just to save the oil, but to prevent the total collapse of the capital markets that fund its technological edge. The final layer of this crisis is perhaps the most daunting for the traditional world order. The realization that superior technology does not always guarantee a strategic or economic victory. The conflict in the Gulf has exposed a massive cost asymmetry that is bleeding the U.S. Treasury dry. The core of Iran's military strategy isn't about matching the U.S. in firepower, it is about outspending them until intervention becomes unsustainable. The cheap aggressor, Iran utilizes swarms of drones costing as little as $20,000 to $35,000 and ballistic missiles priced around $250,000. The expensive defender. To counter these, the U.S. relies on systems like THAAD. A single interceptor costs between $12 million and $15 million. Because these are not 100% accurate, the military doctrine often requires firing 2 or 3 shots per target. The result? The U.S. is effectively spending $30 to $45 million to shoot down a drone that costs less than a mid-range sedan. In just the first 100 hours of fighting, the U.S. and its allies burned through $1.7 billion in interceptors. This is a mathematical trap that American taxpayers are unknowingly funding. Iran is not just targeting ships, they are decapitating the eyes of the defense systems. By specifically targeting the THAAD radars, which cost up to $500 million per unit, Iran is rendering multi-billion-dollar defense batteries blind and useless. The fact that the U.S. had to pull a THAAD system from South Korea, leaving a strategic gap in the Pacific just to replace destroyed units in the Gulf, proves that the U.S. military is being stretched to its absolute breaking point. The text concludes with a sobering historical reminder. Every single global recession since World War II, excluding the pandemic, has been preceded by a sharp spike in oil prices. The current reality, oil prices have already surged 40% since the start of this conflict. The social cost. While billionaires and politicians argue over borders, the working class is being destroyed. From food delivery riders in India to civil servants in Thailand, the cost of living is becoming a crisis of survival. This war is far more than a regional dispute. It is a systemic shock to the fragile interconnectedness of our modern life. If the Strait of Hormuz does not reopen soon, the acute food insecurity predicted for 45 million people will only be the beginning of a much larger global collapse.
As we synthesize the layers of this crisis, from the shifting of the global reserve currency to the literal threat to the world's drinking water, a final, sobering picture emerges. This isn't just a story about a regional war, it is an autopsy of modern global fragility. For decades, the global economy has optimized for efficiency, not resilience. We built a world where food in the Midwest depends on gas from Qatar. AI chips in Silicon Valley depend on helium from the Persian Gulf. National security in South Korea is sacrificed to plug a hole in Middle Eastern defenses. The conflict has exposed that our entire modern existence flows through a handful of geographic choke points. When one link breaks, the entire chain doesn't just slow down, it begins to disintegrate. The text makes it clear. The world was already weakened by the $22 trillion loss of the pandemic. Adding a 20% global oil shutdown on top of that is not a crisis, it is a systemic reset. We are witnessing the end of the unipolar world where the US dollar and US Navy guaranteed stability. The East is insulating itself. China's massive oil reserves and land-based pipelines suggest they prepared for this scenario years ago. The West is overextended. The U.S. is being forced into a cost-asymmetric war where it spends millions to defend against thousands, depleting its treasury and moving its most advanced assets like a frantic chess player trying to cover too many squares at once. Ultimately, the analysis returns to the most important factor: the people. The warning from the United Nations about 45 million people facing acute food insecurity is a reminder that geopolitics has a human cost. When the strait closes, the price isn't just paid in dollars or yuan, it's paid in missed meals in India, shuttered universities in Bangladesh, and a disappearing middle class in the West. History tells us that every spike in oil prices of this magnitude leads to a recession. The only question remains: how long can the world endure this before the new normal becomes a permanent decline?